The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October. Maria had kissed her husband goodbye at the door, feeling the familiar roughness of his 5 o'clock shadow against her cheek. James was already wearing his Navy uniform, freshly pressed and crisp, his badge gleaming in the early morning light streaming through their kitchen window. He had smiled that devastating smile of his, the one that had made her fall in love with him 15 years ago at college, and promised he'd be home by 7 for Danny's birthday dinner. Their son would be turning 3, and James had insisted on leaving work early to celebrate with them. He'd even ordered a dinosaur cake from Danny's favorite bakery downtown. That was the last time Maria would ever see her husband alive. The phone call came at 2:47 p.m. She remembered the exact time because she'd been checking the kitchen clock repeatedly, waiting for James to arrive home early as promised. The call wasn't from James. It was from Captain at the precinct, his voice strangled and formal in a way that immediately triggered alarm bells in her nervous system. There had been an accident. James had been involved in a traffic stop on Route 40, just 5 miles from their home. A drunk driver had run a red light, T-boning James's patrol car with devastating force. She didn't need to hear the rest of the words. She already knew. She could feel it in the way the captain paused before speaking, in the hollow tone of his voice, in the sudden silence that seemed to swallow the entire world. Maria had dropped the phone. She dropped it and simply stood there in the middle of their pristine kitchen, surrounded by decorations for Danny's birthday party, blue and green streamers dangling from the ceiling, a banner reading "Happy 3rd Birthday, Danny," taped across the refrigerator. The dinosaur cake sat on the counter in its white box from the bakery, decorated with little green frosting T-Rexes. Everything looked cheerful and festive and horribly, mockingly wrong. She picked Danny up from preschool an hour later, moving through the world like a ghost. Her body functioned on autopilot, speaking to the teachers, buckling Danny into his car seat, driving home. But her mind was fractured, splintered, unable to process the incomprehensible reality that had just been thrust upon her. She couldn't tell him. How could she possibly tell her 3-year-old son that the father he adored, the man who taught him to throw a ball and read bedtime stories in silly voices, the man who called him Buddy and Little Man, and promised him dinosaur cakes on special days, that man was gone forever? Danny chattered excitedly in the backseat about his day at school, about the finger painting he'd made, about how his friend had knocked over the blocks. He had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse. He had no idea that when he got home, there would be no father waiting with a special birthday surprise. There would be no candles to blow out, no happy birthday sung off-key by his daddy, no presents wrapped in colorful paper. When they arrived home, Maria found 2 police cars already in the driveway. Her heart seized. She couldn't breathe. Officer stood on the porch, his uniform impeccable but his face devastated. Behind him was another officer she didn't recognize. They'd come to deliver the news in person as protocol demanded. But Danny was with her and she couldn't let him hear it. She quickly ushered him inside to the living room, turned on the television to an animated movie, and shut the door. The words they spoke seemed to come from very far away, as if spoken through water. Multiple lacerations, internal bleeding. The drunk driver had been traveling at 60 miles per hour when he hit the patrol car. James had been pronounced dead at the scene. There was nothing anyone could do. She was so very sorry for her loss. They stood there, these trained officers who'd likely delivered this terrible news countless times before, waiting for her response. But Maria couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could only stare at the wall behind them, at the family portrait hanging there, taken just 6 months ago. James was in it, his arm around her, Danny perched on his shoulders, all 3 of them smiling at the camera with no idea that this happiness had an expiration date. The next 72 hours were a blur of nightmare logistics. Phone calls to family, arrangements with the funeral home, selection of a casket she never wanted to choose, notification of friends and relatives who would want to attend the service. The police department had been surprisingly helpful, assigning an officer to assist with arrangements, bringing casseroles and flowers that piled up on the front porch like a shrine. But none of it felt real. None of it any sense. 3 days after that terrible Tuesday, they stood in the cemetery in the pouring rain. October in Ohio could be unpredictable, and that day, the weather seemed to mock their grief, dark, gray, cold, and relentlessly wet. Maria held Danny's small hand as they approached the open grave. Her extended family stood behind them. Her parents, her sister, James's parents who looked like they'd aged 10 years in 3 days. The priest spoke about James's service to the community, his dedication to his duty, his love for his family. The words were kind and well-intentioned, but they couldn't possibly capture who James was. James wasn't just his job. He was the man who sang terrible songs while cooking breakfast on Sunday mornings. He was the man who cried watching animated movies with their son. He was the man who had looked at Danny the moment he was born and said, "He looks like you. He has your eyes." He was the man who left little love notes in Maria's lunch bag. He was irreplaceable. He was everything. Danny stood beside her in a tiny suit that matched his father's dress uniform. James's department had insisted on the gesture. The boy stared at the mahogany casket being lowered into the ground with an expression of complete confusion. He didn't understand where his daddy was going. He didn't understand why everyone was crying. He didn't understand that his life would never be the same. "Where Daddy going?" Danny asked, tugging on Maria's sleeve, his small voice impossibly loud in the cemetery's heavy silence. Maria knelt down, pulling her son into her arms, unable to find words adequate for this moment. He's gone, sweetheart. Daddy had to go to heaven." "When he come back?" Danny asked, his little face scrunched in confusion. That was the question that broke her completely. She held him, pressing her face into his soft hair, inhaling the familiar scent of his strawberry shampoo, and whispered, "He's not coming back, baby. Daddy's not coming back." That night Danny cried silently in his sleep, his small body trembling against hers. He didn't understand death. He only understood absence. And from that moment forward, his life would be defined by it. The moment heard the radio crackle with news of the accident, his entire body went cold. A patrol car had been struck on Route 40, officer down, multiple units responding. He didn't need to hear the name to know. James was his partner's handler. James was his friend. James was one of the best men had ever known. When the confirmation came through, Officer James, deceased at the scene, had to pull over, unable to see through the sudden blur of his vision. But Rex didn't know yet. Rex was in the police department's climate-controlled kennel, waiting for his handler to return from patrol like he always did. Rex didn't know that James would never return, that James would never again scratch behind his ears, never again praise him for a job well done, never again share his lunch with him in the back of the patrol car. Rex had been trained for many things, tracking suspects, detecting explosives, apprehending dangerous criminals, but nothing had trained him for this. Pulled into the precinct parking lot 2 hours after the accident. The entire department was in chaos. Officers stood in clusters, their faces ashen. Captain was in his office, the door closed, making phone calls. Some officers were openly crying. The station's usual controlled energy had fractured into something raw and devastating. Walked past them all with single-minded purpose, heading directly to the kennels in the back of the building. Rex was standing at the fence of his enclosure, his ears perked, his eyes expectant. When he saw, his tail wagged hopefully. His chest tightened. The German shepherd pressed his massive head against the chain-link fence and reached through to stroke the dog's ears. "I'm so sorry, buddy," whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." For the first few hours, Rex didn't seem to understand. He ate his dinner, though less enthusiastically than usual, and lay in his favorite spot in the kennel, his head resting on his paws. But by the evening, something had shifted. When the shift change happened and James didn't appear to collect him as he always did, Rex began to pace, back and forth, back and forth. His nails clicked against the concrete floor with an anxious rhythm. He whimpered softly, a sound so heartbreaking that other officers had to turn away. Stayed late that night, sitting outside Rex's kennel for hours. He brought the dog treats, fresh water, tried to engage him in play. Nothing worked. Rex would accept the treats half-heartedly, then return to his packing. His dark eyes had taken on a distant, confused quality, the eyes of a being trying to process something his mind couldn't fully comprehend. The funeral was held on Thursday. Attended in full dress uniform, standing in the back of the church, unable to sing the hymns or recite the prayers. All he could think about was Rex, who was being cared for by one of the junior officers back at the precinct. The dog had refused breakfast that morning. He'd barely drunk any water. By Friday, Rex had stopped eating entirely. "We need to do something," said to Captain during a briefing. "Rex is dying. He's literally dying from grief." The captain looked up from his paperwork, his own eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He'd known James for 23 years, had watched him grow from a rookie into one of the department's finest officers. "What do you suggest? We can't force him to eat. We can't explain to a dog that his partner isn't coming back." Had no answers. That night he took Rex home with him, against protocol, but nobody was in the mood to enforce regulations. His apartment was sparse, designed for a bachelor with little time for domestic niceties. He set up a bed for Rex in the living room and sat with the dog through the night. Rex lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his eyes staring at nothing. "Come on, buddy," pleaded, running his hands over Rex's coat. "You have to eat, you have to stay strong. James wouldn't want this for you." The mention of James's name caused Rex's ears to perk up slightly, and he let out a whimper so anguished that had to leave the room to compose himself. Over the weekend, took Rex to the veterinary clinic. Doctor examined the dog thoroughly, running blood tests, taking x-rays, checking his vital signs. Everything came back physically normal. Rex was in perfect health, his body anyway. His spirit was another matter entirely. "There's nothing medically wrong with him," doctor said, her expression deeply sad. "He's experiencing profound grief. Some dogs can't process the loss of their handler. They bond so intensely, you see. For Rex, James wasn't just his handler, he was his entire world, his reason for existing, and now that reason is gone." "How long?" asked, afraid of the answer. "If he continues to refuse food, a week, maybe 2. Depression can be as fatal as any disease, officer. Rex needs a reason to live. He needs to feel like his life still has purpose." Left the clinic with that grim prognosis weighing heavily on him. That night, he sat in his apartment with Rex, scrolling through his phone. He found videos of James and Rex working together, Rex tracking a suspect through the woods, Rex alerting to drugs hidden in a vehicle, Rex receiving commendations from the department. In every video, the bond between man and dog was evident. James would look at Rex with such pride, such affection. And Rex would look at James like he was the center of his entire universe. "I have to help you," whispered to the dog, "but I don't know how." He called Maria on Monday morning, his voice hesitant. "Mrs., it's Officer, I know this is a terrible time, but I need to ask you something. It might sound strange." Maria's voice was hollow when she answered. Could hear cartoons playing in the background, Danny watching TV, probably for the 100th time that day, seeking distraction from the incomprehensible loss. "Rex is dying," said bluntly. "He's not eating. He's not responding to anything. The vet says he's grieving so deeply that he's losing the will to live. And I know this might be the last thing you want to deal with right now, but I wondered if maybe Danny could help. If maybe seeing Danny, who James loved so much, could remind Rex that there's still life worth living." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Could hear Maria's breathing, uncertain and wavering. "I don't know," she finally said. "I don't know if seeing Rex would help or hurt, every reminder of James." "I understand," said quietly. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it might help them both. They're both grieving the same person. Maybe they could grieve together." Another pause, then so quietly almost missed it. "Okay, bring him by tomorrow afternoon." Hung up the phone and looked at Rex, who was staring at nothing, his ribs visible through his coat. "Hold on, buddy," he whispered. "I think I might have found a way to help you." That night Rex ate a few bites of food for the first time in 5 days. It wasn't much, barely an ounce, but it was something. It was hope. Sat in his truck outside Maria's house, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. In the back seat, Rex lay motionless, his massive body draped across the bench seat like a piece of discarded furniture. The dog hadn't reacted at all when had loaded him into the vehicle an hour ago. He'd simply, moving with the mechanical obedience of a being who no longer cared where he went or what happened to him. The neighborhood was quiet and suburban, lined with well-maintained homes and manicured lawns. The kind of place where families lived, where children played in yards, where dads came home from work and grilled burgers and threw baseballs with their sons. Wondered how many times James had pulled into this driveway, parking his patrol car in the garage, eager to shed his uniform and become simply a husband and father. Checked his phone. 2:15 p.m. Maria had said afternoon was fine, but he was early. He sat there, trying to calm his racing thoughts, trying to find the right words to explain what he was about to do. Because really, when you thought about it, this was insane. Who shows up at a widow's house 3 days after her husband's funeral with the dead man's grief-stricken dog? Who potentially reopens wounds that are still bleeding? But then he glanced in the mirror and saw Rex's ribs rising and falling in shallow breaths, and he knew he didn't have a choice. This was the only option left. At 2:47 p.m., turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck. He took a moment to check Rex, running his hand along the dog's side. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "Let's go see Danny." Getting Rex out of the truck was like coaxing a statue to walk. The dog moved slowly, his legs unsteady, his head hanging low. Had to guide him by the collar, half supporting the massive animal's weight. They made their way up the front walkway, past the flower beds that looked neglected now, past the wreath on the door that must have been a sympathy offering. His hand trembled as he pressed the doorbell. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened slowly. Maria looked like a ghost of herself. She'd been beautiful in the funeral photos had seen, composed, dignified despite her devastation. But now, in the privacy of her home, the mask was completely off. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She wore an oversized sweatshirt that probably belonged to James. When she saw Rex, her body went rigid. "Officer," she said, her voice carefully controlled, though could hear the tremor beneath it. "Come in." She stepped aside and led Rex into the foyer. The house smelled like a mixture of flowers from the arrangements people had sent, and underneath that, the faint scent of James's cologne. Pictures covered the walls, James and Maria on their wedding day, James holding newborn Danny, James and Danny playing in the backyard, James in his uniform at his graduation from the academy. Maria stared at Rex without speaking, her jaw working as though she was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage them. "He's not eating," said quietly. "He hasn't been since Tuesday. The vet says his body is fine, but his spirit is shutting down. Without James, he doesn't see a reason to live." "Officer," Maria started but pressed on. He needed to say all of this while he still had the courage. "I know this is hard. I know it's the last thing you need right now. But they're the same, Mrs. They're both grieving the same person. And I think maybe they could help each other. I don't have any other ideas left. I don't know what else to do." Maria turned away from him, her shoulders hunched, her arms wrapped around herself. For a moment, thought she was going to tell him to leave, that this was a mistake. But then she took a shaky breath. "Let me check on Danny," she said. She disappeared down the hallway, leaving standing in the foyer with Rex, surrounded by photographs of James smiling. A few minutes later, Maria returned. "He's awake from his nap. He's watching cartoons in the living room. I I think we should do this carefully. He's been so quiet since." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They walked into the living room together. The space was chaos in a way that only a household with a young child could be. Toys scattered across the floor, a small table with coloring books and crayons, a blanket fort made of couch cushions. And sitting on a small rug in front of the television, watching an animated show with blank, unseeing eyes, was Danny. He was so small. Had seen Danny before at department functions, but seeing him now, in the context of his father's death, in the context of his grief, made his heart ache. The boy was wearing dinosaur pajamas and his hair stuck up at odd angles. He looked lost. He looked like his entire world had been ripped away. Which it had. Danny didn't immediately notice them. He was too absorbed in the television, or perhaps too deep in whatever psychological space children retreated to when reality became unbearable. But then Maria made a small sound, and Danny glanced over. His eyes widened. He saw first, then his gaze shifted downward to Rex. "Baby," Maria said softly, "this is Rex. This was Daddy's friend from work." Danny's eyes filled with tears, though no sobs came. He simply stared at the dog, his small body trembling. Gently led Rex toward the boy. The dog's entire demeanor changed slightly, nothing dramatic but something shifted. His ears lifted. His nose twitched. Rex's eyes, which had been so vacant and dead for days, seemed to focus. He could smell James on this house. He could sense James's presence here, in the pictures on the walls, in the house itself. "Go ahead," encouraged softly. "Go see him." Rex took a slow step toward Danny, then another. Danny didn't move away. He simply waited, his eyes wide and glistening, his hands clenched in his lap. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, and could see her holding back a sob. When Rex was just a few feet away from Danny, the dog did something hadn't expected. Instead of approaching with the enthusiasm a dog might normally show, Rex slowly lay down on the carpet, his massive body stretching out, his head coming to rest just a few feet from the boy. The two of them, a 3-year-old boy and a 100-pound German shepherd, stared at each other across a small distance. No movement, no sound, just two grieving creatures recognizing each other's pain. Looked at Maria and saw tears streaming down her face. He reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. "I'll leave them," he whispered. I'll give them time." And as he stepped back, watching the boy and the dog begin their tentative connection, felt something shift in his own chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for both of them after all. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, tangible, heavy, almost unbearable. Danny and Rex remained motionless, separated by perhaps 3 feet of living room carpet. Had retreated to the kitchen doorway, his presence small and unobtrusive. Maria stood frozen beside him, one hand pressed against her chest, as though trying to hold her heart inside her body. Nothing happened for a full minute, then 2, 3. Rex didn't move. He lay completely still, his massive head resting on his front paws, his dark eyes never leaving Danny's face. The dog's breathing was slow and deliberate, as if he too understood the significance of this moment, as if he recognized that something sacred was about to unfold. Danny, for his part, stared at Rex with an intensity that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old. His small fingers twisted in his lap, his body rigid with tension. A strand of hair fell across his forehead. His lips were pressed into a thin line. "Daddy's dog," Maria whispered to herself, barely audibly. That's what James always called him when he talked about Rex to Danny. Daddy's dog. That was their thing. Nodded, understanding the significance. James had talked about Rex constantly during work, sharing stories about the dog's training, his successes, his personality quirks. He'd shown Danny pictures on his phone, told him that when he was older, maybe he could watch Daddy and his special dog work together. 5 minutes passed, still nothing. Was beginning to wonder if bringing Rex here had been a terrible mistake. Perhaps this was too much too soon. Perhaps the proximity to James's presence in this house, in this space, was only making Rex's grief worse. He was about to gently suggest they give them more space when Danny did something small but significant. He moved his right hand. It wasn't a dramatic movement, just a subtle shift of his fingers along the carpet, reaching maybe an inch closer to Rex. But to, who had been watching intensely for any sign of interaction, it felt monumental. Rex's entire body stiffened. His ears perked up. His nostrils flared, and he took a long, deliberate breath, as if scenting something precious in the air. But he didn't move toward Danny. He remained exactly where he was, allowing the boy to come to him at his own pace. Another minute passed. Then Danny moved again, this time pushing himself slightly forward on his bottom, his clad legs sliding across the carpet. He was moving closer, inch by inch, foot by foot. Felt Maria's hand grab his arm, her nails digging in slightly. He knew she was holding back a sob. When Danny was within arm's reach, he stopped. He sat there, breathing heavily, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. His eyes were glistening now, tears forming but not yet falling. He stared at Rex, and Rex stared back at him. "It's okay, baby," Maria whispered from across the room. "It's okay." Very slowly, so slowly it seemed to take an eternity, Danny reached out his right hand. His small fingers, chubby and pale, extended toward Rex's massive head. The moment his fingertips made contact with the dog's fur, something shifted in the room. The air felt different, charged with emotion. Rex's eyes closed just for a moment, and when he opened them again, they seemed different. Not healed, the grief was still there, but somehow acknowledged, validated. Danny's fingers moved across Rex's head, stroking gently, exploring the texture of the dog's coat. His touch was tentative, careful, as if he were handling something infinitely precious and fragile. He traced the outline of Rex's ear, following the curve of it with surprising gentleness for such a young child. "Oh my God," Maria breathed, and knew she was experiencing the same feeling he was, the sense of witnessing something profound, something that transcended normal understanding. Danny moved his hand down Rex's neck, and the dog remained perfectly still, trusting, vulnerable. His massive frame seemed to relax under the boy's touch, as if the simple contact was drawing something poisonous out of him. 15 minutes, 20, 30 minutes of this sacred, silent communion. Checked his watch, hardly believing how much time had passed. And still they remained like this, the boy and the dog, two broken souls communicating in a language that had nothing to do with words. Then Danny leaned forward. His small body bent toward Rex, and he pressed his forehead against the dog's shoulder. For a long moment he simply held there, his tiny arms wrapping around Rex's thick neck, his face buried in the dog's fur. Maria made a sound, half gasp, half sob, put his arm around her, supporting her weight as her knees seemed to buckle slightly. Rex's body began to tremble, subtle at first, barely noticeable, but growing more pronounced. His eyes squeezed shut, and his jaw clenched. Every muscle in his massive frame seemed to shake with the effort of containing something that was trying to burst out of him. Realized what was happening. Rex was crying. Dogs couldn't produce tears the way humans could, but they could grieve. They could feel sorrow so profound it shook their entire body. And this dog, this magnificent, loyal, heartbroken dog, was releasing weeks of pain through his shaking frame. Danny held on, his small arms stretched as far as they could go around Rex's neck, his face pressed against the dog's chest. He wasn't letting go. He was anchoring Rex to life, to the present moment, to the reality that though they had both lost something precious, they still had each other. For what felt like hours but was probably only a few more minutes, they remained locked together, boy and dog, grief and compassion, loss and connection. Then very gradually, Rex's trembling began to subside. His breathing slowed. His body relaxed incrementally. And Danny, seeming to sense that the immediate storm of emotion had passed, slowly pulled back just enough to look Rex in the face. "He's hungry," said softly to Marya. "Look, his eyes are clearer, his focus is sharper." Marya nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. "Should I get him some food?" asked. Marya didn't answer immediately. She was too busy watching her son and her late husband's dog, watching the inexplicable connection that had formed between them in the span of 30 minutes, watching two broken pieces find each other in the wreckage of loss. Finally she whispered, "Yes, get him food, get him whatever he needs." Because in that moment they both understood something fundamental. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a bridge between Danny and James. He was a living connection to a man they'd both lost. And as long as Rex lived, James lived too, in memory, in spirit, in the love that continued to flow through the heart of his faithful companion. The greatest gift a police dog could ever give wasn't catching criminals or detecting drugs. It was this: healing, connection, hope. Returned from the kitchen with a bowl of food and fresh water. He set them down quietly near Rex, not wanting to break the profound silence that still hung over the room. Marya had moved slightly closer to the boy and dog, but she remained standing, her hand clasped over her mouth, her body trembling with the effort of containing her emotions. Danny still had his small arms wrapped around Rex's neck, his head tucked against the dog's shoulder. Rex's eyes were open now, no longer squeezed shut in grief, but they still held that same profound sadness. The dog's breathing had slowed to a steady rhythm, and his body was no longer shaking, but he made no move to pull away or to eat from the bowl had placed nearby. It was as if neither of them wanted to break this connection, as if they both understood, on some instinctive level, that what they were sharing was rare and sacred and might never come again. Minutes stretched by. The animated movie on the television continued to play, but nobody was watching it anymore. The whole universe had shrunk down to this one moment, this one space, this boy and this dog holding each other in the wreckage of their shared loss. Then Danny shifted slightly. He pulled back just enough to look at Rex's face, his small hands still resting on either side of the dog's massive head. His eyes were still wet with tears, but his expression had changed. There was something determined in his small features, something purposeful. His lips opened, his throat moved, and for the first time in 3 days, since the moment he'd learned his father was gone, Danny spoke. "Daddy's dog," he whispered. The words were so quiet that almost didn't hear them, but he did hear them, and more importantly, so did everyone else in the room. Marya's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the couch for support. A sound escaped her, half gasp, half sob, that seemed to contain 3 days' worth of anguish compressed into a single, broken utterance. But it was Rex's reaction that transformed the moment from profound to transcendent. The dog's entire body went rigid, every muscle tensed at once. His ears snapped forward to full attention. His eyes widened and for a split second thought the dog might be frightened. But then something changed in Rex's expression. The grief didn't disappear. It was still there, written across his features in the subtle language of canine emotion, but something else flickered into being alongside it. Recognition. Understanding. Purpose. Rex let out a sound that had never heard the dog make before. It started as a whimper but grew stronger, deeper, until it became a howl, not the threatening sound of a predator, but something raw and mournful and infinitely sad. It was the sound of grief finally finding voice. It was the sound of a heart too full of sorrow to remain silent any longer. "Daddy's dog," Danny repeated, his voice slightly stronger now, slightly more confident. "Daddy's dog, Daddy's dog." With each repetition, his voice grew clearer. His small chin jutted out slightly with determination. He was speaking these words as if speaking them aloud could somehow bridge the impossible gap between life and death, between presence and absence. And Rex was responding to those words with his entire being. His howl continued, a counterpoint to Danny's small, determined voice. It was as if the dog was saying, "Yes, yes, I am Daddy's dog, and I will never stop being Daddy's dog, and neither will you ever stop being Daddy's son." Tears streamed down his face now. He'd been trained to remain professional, to maintain emotional distance, but there was no distance possible here. This was too real, too raw, too profoundly human, or in Rex's case, profoundly canine, to remain unmoved by. Maria had sunk down onto the couch, her body racked with sobs. Her hand reached out toward Danny and Rex, but she didn't try to pull them apart or interrupt them. She was witnessing something sacred, and she knew better than to interfere. "Daddy's dog," Danny said again, and this time he wrapped his arms around Rex's neck once more, pulling the dog close, burying his face in the thick fur. "Daddy's dog, Daddy's dog." Rex pressed his massive head down, cradling the boy gently, his howls softening into whimpers and then into an almost silence. Just the sound of two beings breathing together, connected in grief and love, and the inexplicable bond that sometimes forms between a child and an animal. His phone felt heavy in his pocket. He knew he should probably call someone, Maria's family, the police department, someone. But he found himself frozen, unable to move, unable to break this moment into pieces. 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes of Danny repeating those two words over and over again, each time with more clarity, more strength, more purpose. And Rex, listening intently, responding with subtle shifts in his body language, with the gentle pressure of his massive head against the boy's small frame, with the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against Danny's chest. "Daddy's dog," Danny whispered one last time, his voice growing drowsy, his words slightly slurred by exhaustion. His arms relaxed around Rex's neck, and his eyes began to flutter closed. Rex seemed to sense the shift immediately. The dog gently turned his head and began licking Danny's cheek with his rough tongue, not frantic or desperate, but gentle and deliberate, as if trying to kiss away the boy's tears. Maria moved then. She rose from the couch on shaky legs and approached them slowly. Moved to help her, supporting her arm, but she waved him off. She needed to do this herself. She sank down onto the carpet beside her son and the dog and wrapped her arms around both of them, around Danny and around Rex. The three of them, a widow, a child, and a faithful dog, formed a knot of sorrow and love and desperate, fragile hope. "Thank you," Maria whispered, though wasn't sure if she was speaking to Rex or to James or to whatever force in the universe had brought them all to this moment. "Thank you for staying with him. Thank you for loving him as much as he loved you." And there, on the living room carpet of a house that still smelled like a dead man's cologne, realized that he was witnessing the exact moment when healing began. Not healing in the sense of the wounds disappearing, but healing in the truest sense, the acknowledgement of pain, the validation of grief, the recognition that love doesn't end just because the beloved is gone. It continues, it transforms, it lives on in the hearts of those left behind. And sometimes, it lives on in the faithful eyes of a dog who refuses to forget. The house fell into a different kind of quiet after Danny fell asleep, still cradled against Rex's chest, his small hand tangled in the dog's fur. Rex hadn't moved. The dog remained absolutely still, his chin resting gently on top of the boy's head, his dark eyes open and watchful, as if standing guard over something infinitely precious. Had moved to the kitchen, needing to escape the intensity of the moment, needing to process what he'd just witnessed. Maria followed him, her movements slow and dazed, as if she was still only partially present in the physical world. She sank into a kitchen chair without speaking, filled a glass of water and set it in front of her. She stared at it for a moment, then picked it up and took a long drink, as if she'd been dying of thirst. "I've known James for 12 years, said quietly, leaning against the counter. 12 years. We started at the academy together. I watched him grow into one of the finest officers I've ever known. But these past few days, I honestly didn't know if he'd left anything behind that could survive his death. Maria looked up at him, her red-rimmed eyes filled with a confusion that understood completely. I was wrong, continued. He left everything behind. He left Rex, and he left Danny. And somehow those two broken pieces found each other, and in that finding, they're making each other whole again. Maria's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they seemed different, not just tears of grief, but tears of something else. Understanding, relief, perhaps even the first fragile shoots of acceptance. When James first brought Rex home to show me, Maria said softly, I was terrified. He was so big, so powerful. I worried about Danny around him, but James just laughed and said, Rex is a protector. He's a guardian. That's his whole purpose in life, to keep people safe. She paused, her voice trembling. I always thought he meant that in a professional sense, catching criminals, detecting drugs, protecting the community. Nodded, understanding where she was going with this. But he's protecting Danny now, Maria continued, her voice breaking. He's protecting him from the worst of this grief. He's letting Danny know that someone understands. Someone else lost James too, and that makes Danny's loss somehow bearable, less isolating. In the living room, Danny slept on, completely unaware of the profound shift that was occurring in the adults around him. His small face was peaceful for the first time in 3 days. The tension that had locked his features since learning of his father's death had finally released. When did you realize, asked, that Rex needed this, that Danny needed this? The moment I opened the door and saw him, Maria admitted. I saw myself in Rex's eyes, that same lost, broken expression, that same desperate searching for something that was never coming back, and I thought, maybe they could help each other. Maybe grief shared is grief that doesn't crush you quite so completely. Thought about Rex's refusal to eat, the dog's gradual shutdown over the past few days. He thought about Danny's silence, the boy's retreat into a protective numbness. Two grieving beings on parallel tracks, descending into darkness. And then had brought them together. I can't explain what happened, said slowly. What I saw in the living room, that was something beyond normal understanding. It was like they were speaking in a language that only animals and young children understand. A language without words, but completely clear. James used to say that Rex understood him better than most people ever could, Maria said. He said that after a hard shift, when he didn't want to talk but needed to process, he would just sit with Rex, and the dog would rest his head in James's lap, and somehow, without a single word passing between them, everything would be okay again. Felt something click into place in his mind. That's what they were doing in there, Danny and Rex. They were speaking to each other in the way that James taught them both, silently, completely, unconditionally. Maria looked down at her hands. When Danny said those words, Daddy's dog, I realized something. James is gone, and that's a truth we have to live with every single day for the rest of our lives. But Rex isn't gone. And as long as Rex is alive, as long as Danny has Rex, he has a living connection to his father, a way to remember, a way to feel close. More than that, said quietly, Rex gives Danny permission to grieve, because Rex is grieving too. Danny can see that someone he loves is sad, and that's normal. That's okay. That's how you're supposed to feel when someone you love dies. Maria nodded slowly, understanding the profundity of what was saying. Children learn to process emotion not from lectures or explanations, but from watching how the important people, and in this case, important animals, in their lives handle difficulty. We have to keep them together, Maria said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of absolute certainty. Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, those two need each other. The department will support it, assured her. I know Captain. James was like a son to him. He would move heaven and earth if it meant helping Danny and honoring James's memory. Every time I look at Rex, Maria said slowly, I see James, not in a painful way anymore, but in a beautiful way. I see his loyalty, his dedication, his capacity for unconditional love. I see all the best parts of him, preserved and living and breathing. Understood what she meant. Rex was like a living photograph of James at his best, not frozen in time but continually growing, continuing on, refusing to let grief consume him. "He needs to eat," said, gesturing toward the living room where Rex and Danny still lay intertwined on the carpet. "Now that he's found his reason to live, his body will start demanding sustenance again." As if on cue, Rex's ears perked up. The dog's head lifted carefully, so carefully trying not to disturb Danny's sleep. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of the food had set out earlier. For the first time since James's death, saw something flicker in Rex's eyes: hunger, appetite, the desire to live. "Go on," Maria said gently. "Go eat, boy, you need your strength." Rex looked torn, clearly reluctant to leave Danny's side, but his body made the decision for him. Hunger, along with returning will to live, won out over his protective instinct. He rose carefully, his movements still stiff and painful, and made his way to the food bowl. He ate slowly at first, as if his body had forgotten how, but with each bite, his movements became more confident. Maria and watched from the kitchen doorway, witnessing the miraculous resurrection of a creature they'd both feared was lost to grief. "Thank you," Maria said too, placing her hand on his arm, "for bringing him here, for believing that this could help." Shook his head. James brought them together. James and his love for Rex and his love for Danny. That's what's happening here. James's love is still doing its work even now. And as they stood there, watching a grieving dog eat, watching a sleeping boy dream peacefully for the first time in days, understood something fundamental about loss and love and the incredible ways the human and canine heart finds to keep going. Some bonds transcend death. Some connections are strong enough to bridge even the impossible gulf between the living and the gone. Truck pulled into Maria's driveway every Tuesday and Friday at 3 o'clock, like clockwork. It had been 4 weeks since that first visit, and the routine had become sacred. Danny would watch from the window starting at 2:45, his small nose pressed against the glass, his excitement building with each passing minute. By the time opened the truck's back door, Danny would be bouncing on his toes, his mouth forming words before his voice could catch up. "Rex, Rex is here, Rex is here." The transformations had been subtle but undeniable. Rex's coat, which had been dull and lifeless just weeks ago, now shone with a lustrous sheen that spoke to his returning health. The dog had regained the weight he'd lost, his ribs no longer visible through his fur. More importantly, his eyes had regained their clarity. The profound sadness was still there, it would always be there, but it was no longer the only thing visible in those dark depths. There was also purpose, connection, love. But the most dramatic transformation was in Danny. The boy who had barely spoken in those first 3 days after his father's death now chattered constantly. He talked to Rex about his days at preschool, about what he'd learned, about the friends he'd made. He sang songs to the dog, off-key and enthusiastic. He showed Rex's drawings, narrating each squiggle and line with the confidence of a young artist displaying his masterpieces in a major gallery. "This is Daddy," Danny said one afternoon in early November, holding up a crayon drawing. "And this is Daddy's dog. They're playing together in heaven." Maria, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, felt her throat tighten. A month ago, such a statement would have sent her into a tailspin of grief. But now, hearing it, she recognized it for what it was: Danny's way of processing loss, his way of understanding that his father was gone but not forgotten, his way of integrating the reality of death into a narrative he could comprehend. "That's beautiful, buddy," she said, moving over to ruffle his hair. "Daddy would love that picture." Rex rested his head on Danny's lap, and the boy reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, a gesture that had become as automatic and natural as breathing. They had developed their own language over these 4 weeks, a system of communication that required no words but was perfectly understood by both parties. When Danny was sad, Rex would rest his massive head on the boy's lap and simply be present. When Danny was energetic and playful, Rex would engage in gentle games, allowing the boy to pretend he was riding a horse or that they were brave knights on a quest. When Danny needed comfort, Rex would curl up beside him, his warm body a reassuring anchor in the uncertainty of a world without his father. Captain had been more than supportive. He not only approved the visits but had quietly suggested that perhaps Rex could be temporarily reassigned to a modified duty schedule, allowing him more time for these therapeutic visits with Danny. The department had recognized what was happening here, something extraordinary, something that transcended the normal relationship between a police dog and a child. "This is good for community relations," had said with a knowing smile, but could see the genuine emotion beneath the professional reasoning. The captain had loved James. He understood that helping Danny was a way of honoring James's memory, of ensuring that his sacrifice meant something beyond the tragedy of his death. One Tuesday afternoon in mid-November, Maria made a surprising announcement. "I'd like to bring Danny to the police department," she said as Rex and Danny played in the backyard. "For a visit. I think it's time he saw where his daddy worked, where his daddy and Rex worked together." Nodded slowly, understanding the significance. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Maria watched Danny throw a ball for Rex, the dog bounding after it with energy and enthusiasm that seemed impossible just a month ago. "I'm not sure I'll ever be ready for anything," she said quietly. "But I know Danny needs to see it. He needs to understand what his father did, what Rex and his father accomplished together." The visit was scheduled for the following Saturday morning, coordinated with Captain, and by the time Maria's car pulled into the police station parking lot, there was a banner hanging above the entrance. "Welcome, officer's family." Danny's eyes were wide as saucers as they walked through the doors. Officers who had worked with James came by to shake Maria's hand and to tell Danny stories about his father, how brave he was, how dedicated, how much he loved his son. They brought Danny toy police cars and junior officer badges. They showed him the kennels where Rex stayed during working hours, and they told him about the training Rex underwent, the criminals Rex had helped catch, the lives Rex had helped save. And Rex, recognizing the familiar scents and spaces of his work environment, but also sensing Danny's presence, seemed to move with renewed pride. He stood taller. His tail wagged with more enthusiasm. He was showing the place where he and Officer James had done their important work together. One officer, a woman named Lieutenant Sarah Hayes who had worked closely with James, knelt down beside Danny and said, "Your dad was one of the best handlers I ever knew. And you know what the secret was? He loved Rex with his whole heart. He treated him like family, like a brother. And that made Rex the best police dog in the entire state." Danny considered this solemnly, then looked at Rex. "Daddy loved you very much," he said to the dog, "and I love you very much too." Rex pressed his head against Danny's chest, and Lieutenant Hayes had to turn away, her eyes brimming with tears. That evening, as drove them back to Maria's house, Danny fell asleep in the car, Rex's head resting gently across the boy's lap. Maria stared out the window at the passing landscape and could see something had shifted in her posture. She seemed lighter somehow. Not happy. Grief was still a constant companion in her life and would be for years to come, but less crushed by it. "Thank you," she said quietly too, "for everything, for bringing Rex to us, for understanding what we needed." "James did this," replied. "He trained Rex to be loyal and compassionate and protective, and now Rex is honoring that training by protecting the most important thing James left behind, Danny." Over the following weeks, the routine continued. The regular Tuesday and Friday visits, the growing strength in both Danny and Rex, the quiet, steady healing that comes not from the erasure of pain, but from learning to carry it alongside joy. Danny began sleeping through the night again. He laughed more easily. He engaged with other children at preschool with renewed confidence. He still had moments of sadness, days when missing his father would suddenly overwhelm him. But now he had Rex. He could bury his face in the dog's fur and feel understood. He could share his grief with a being who understood loss in his own profound way. And Rex, in turn, had found his purpose again, not as a police dog catching criminals, but as something equally important: a healer, a guardian, a living link between a boy and the father he would never forget. 1 year and 3 months after Officer James' death, a bronze statue was unveiled in the town square of their suburban Ohio community. The ceremony was attended by over 300 people, police officers from departments across the state, city officials, teachers, neighbors, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by James's service or by the extraordinary story that had unfolded in the months following his death. The statue depicted 2 figures, a man in police uniform kneeling beside a German shepherd, their faces turned toward each other, their connection evident in every line of their bodies. At the base was a plaque that read, "In memory of Officer James and his partner Rex, in service to our community, in honor of a love that transcends death." Danny, now 4 years old and noticeably taller than he'd been a year ago, stood beside his mother in the front row. He was dressed in a small navy blazer and pressed khaki pants, formal wear that he normally would have complained about. But today was important. Today was about his daddy. Rex stood beside them, no longer assigned to active duty, but officially retired and adopted as a full member of Maria's household. The police department had made the transition official in a quiet ceremony 6 months earlier, recognizing that Rex's most important work now was the healing he provided to Danny. The dog wore a special collar for today, a ceremonial piece of leather studded with the official police badge. His coat gleamed in the late afternoon sun. His dark eyes were alert and focused, as if he understood the significance of this moment. When Captain stepped up to the microphone to begin the dedication, his voice wavered slightly. 1 year ago, we lost one of the finest men I've ever known. Officer James was a dedicated servant of this community, a faithful husband and a devoted father. But what we want to honor today isn't just his memory, it's what happened after his death. It's a story about love, about loyalty, about the unbreakable bond between a man and his partner, and how that bond continued to heal even after the man was gone. Paused, collecting himself. When Officer passed away, his partner Rex was devastated. The dog stopped eating. He stopped working. He appeared to have lost the will to live. Simultaneously, Officer's son Danny into a protective silence, unable to process the trauma of losing his father. 2 broken souls moving in parallel toward darkness. He looked directly at who stood off to the side in his full uniform. But one officer believed that these 2 beings who had both loved James so deeply could save each other. Officer brought them together and something miraculous happened. In their shared grief, they found healing. In their mutual loss, they found connection. And in honoring each other's sorrow, they gave each other a reason to live. His eyes glistened with tears. This statue represents more than one man's service to his community. It represents the power of love to survive even death. It represents the incredible capacity for healing that exists when we allow ourselves to grieve together, to mourn together, to remember together. Danny squeezed Maria's hand tightly, his attention fixed on the bronze image of his father and Rex. His small face was serious, contemplative, showing a maturity that no 4-year-old should have to possess. And yet, he possessed it. He had earned it through pain and love and the gradual acceptance of a loss he would carry for the rest of his life. After the ceremony, people approached Maria and Danny with condolences and congratulations. Other officers bent down to speak to Danny, to tell him how proud his father would have been. They petted Rex, thanked the dog for keeping Danny safe, for continuing to love and protect the family James had left behind. But the moment that mattered most came when Danny walked up to the statue and placed his small hand on the bronze dog's face. He closed his eyes for a long moment, and Maria could see his lips moving silently. A prayer, perhaps, a message to his father, an acknowledgement of the inexplicable, unbreakable connection that had saved him. Rex approached the statue as well, and in what seemed like an intentional gesture, pressed his real nose against the bronze leg of the statue. The photograph captured by a local news photographer would later run in newspapers across the state, accompanying the story of the grief that healed itself, the boy and his father's dog, the love that transcends death. That night, as Danny fell asleep, he lay with his head on Rex's side, his small hand resting on the dog's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the fur. Rex's eyes were open, watchful, protective, even in sleep. The bond between them had become something sacred, a connection that transcended species, transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal, transcended even the boundary between life and death. Maria stood in the doorway of Danny's room, watching the two of them sleep. A year ago, she would have believed that her life was over, that the loss of James was something she would never recover from, something that would crush her completely. And she had been right, in a way. She would never fully recover. There would always be a hole where James should be. There would always be moments, birthdays, milestones, ordinary Tuesday mornings, when she would feel the acute sting of his absence. But what she had learned was that you didn't need to recover from grief. You needed to integrate it. You needed to find a way to carry it alongside joy, alongside love, alongside the ongoing miracle of living. And Rex had taught her that, through his devotion to Danny, through his refusal to let grief consume him, through his quiet, steady presence that said without words, yes, we miss him, yes, it hurts, but we're still here, we're still alive, and that's worth something. 6 months later, Danny started kindergarten. His teacher, Mrs., reported that he was a bright, empathetic child who often talked about his daddy and his daddy's dog. He drew pictures in art class of Rex, and he wrote stories about Officer James, stories that were sometimes sad, sometimes funny, but always loving. One day, Danny brought a photograph to school for show and tell. It was the picture of Rex pressing his nose to the bronze statue at the memorial dedication. He stood up in front of his classmates and said, "This is my daddy's dog, Rex. My daddy was a police officer and he died, but Rex helps me remember him. Rex helps me know that my daddy is still here in a different way. Rex is daddy's dog forever." The other kindergartners, not fully understanding the complexity of what Danny was expressing, simply accepted it. Yes, that was Rex. Yes, that was cool. Yes, they wanted to pet Rex someday. But Mrs. understood. She saw in that moment the resilience of a child, the power of love expressed through an animal, the way that trauma, when met with compassion and connection, could become the foundation for profound strength. Years would pass. Danny would grow. He would eventually become a police officer himself, following in his father's footsteps with Rex as his constant companion during his training and early years of service. He would tell the story of his father and his father's dog to recruit classes, to grieving families, to anyone who needed to hear that love survives everything, even death. And Rex, living to the remarkable age of 16, would spend his final years resting at Maria's feet, his job complete. He had saved a boy from the darkest grief. He had honored his fallen handler by protecting the most precious thing James had left behind. He had shown the world that loyalty, devotion, and love could bridge any gap, heal any wound, transcend any boundary. In death, as in life, Officer James and Rex remained partners. Their legacy lived on in Danny, in Maria, in the ripples of healing that spread outward to touch countless other grieving families. Their story became a testament to the power of connection, to the incredible resilience of the human and canine heart. And on quiet nights, when the house was still and the stars shone bright above their small Ohio town, you could almost hear the echo of those two words that had changed everything. Daddy's dog, Daddy's dog. Words that meant, I remember him, I honor him, I will never forget him. Words that meant, love never dies, it only transforms.